I am Larry Blank, and this is From the Pit number 18. And today's guest is Thomas Z. Shepard, also known as Tom Shepard, who is, in my mind, one of the greatest theatrical record producers of all time. Not that he hasn't done other music, but uh, I spent a lifetime growing up listening to all of your recordings. Welcome, Tom.
It's great to see you again, Larry. And let me reciprocate by saying, you are a fabulous arranger, orchestrator, conductor, and I'm honored that you want to do this. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. That means a lot to me. And, I grew up listening to so many recordings that you did. And after reading your book, which everybody must purchase on
Okay.
Amazon,
What's the title?
you tell me the title because,
Recording Broadway, a life in original cast, a life in cast albums. But Recording Broadway is the title. Yeah.
at Recording Broadway. And it's fantastic because it goes way beyond that, of course, about your life and recording other materials as well. Uh, but it's so funny because in the book, one of the first recordings I think you did was Bajor, one
Yeah.
of the first Broadway things. And I actually saw the show twice uh, growing up in New York when my parents would allow me to get on the subway from Queens and go into Manhattan by myself and see shows. And it was a show I was very fond of. It should have run much longer.
For
And
sure.
the recording really captured the essence of the show, which was just first class Broadway entertainment of that time. And just as a point of reference, that was the same season that it was the season right after Funny Girl and Hello Dolly. It was the next season. So those were running on Broadway, but Golden Boy opened at that time, and Ben Franklin in Paris, Bonjour, and and Fiddler, obviously, was a
I
month before.
forgot. Same time. Oh, well, I,
Yeah.
I had a few years ago, after so many years, Walter Marks and I had lunch, and it was really a lot of fun to get together with him again. I suppose he's still alive and kicking. I haven't heard otherwise. I know
Yeah,
he's
I've heard that.
beat me by several years. He's older than I am. But
Mm-hmm.
I thought Bajor was a really, I really liked the score enormously, and the people were fun to work with. And Lehman Angle was an important part of my life. Um, I was in the Lehman Angle workshop at
Mm-hmm.
BNI. A lot of what I wrote, he listened to and made valuable suggestions on. He was friendly with Irene, my wife's family, because he knew her father, Harry Clark. So there were a lot of things, and he lived diagonally across the street from us. We were at 54th Street and First Avenue, and he was the southwest corner, and we were the northeast corner. I mean, there was like,
Uh-huh.
so I saw Lehman a lot.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, when he was dying, I said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" He said, "I'd like to hear the ring cycle." Well, the Schulte recording was available on cassette, and so I bought him the cassettes of the ring cycle, and I was told by, was a Skip, I'm trying to think of his last name. He was with Lehman when Lehman died. Anyway, the point of the story is what I learned was Lehman died listening to, I think it
The
was
ring.
Theory, and that was very touching for me. I was very fond of Lehman. He was very good to me. He really was.
Actually, befriended me as well when I first started conducting because one of his favorite musicians was Harvey Estrin,
Oh
woodwind
yeah,
player.
they played every woodwind in the world practically.
Right. And
And
Harvey had befriended me, and I was having dinner with Harvey, and Lehman walked in, so he introduced me. And a bit later, I was conducting a show called Onward Victoria, which ran one performance with 30 previews. And Lehman came down to the pit to say hello to me. And he looked at my score which was like this. And he said, "That's the biggest score I've ever seen in a Broadway pit." And I said, "Layman, it's the first act." So, and he was very kind to me, nice man, and he was another one of those conductors. I remember how much energy he brought to Bajor
Yeah.
because it was one of those shows that it needed it, and he did it. He was wonderful.
And he was very fond of Nancy Dussault. I think he might have
Yes.
uh, even recommended her to be cast, but he was very fond of her. Um, I had an anecdote, but I decided it's not going to be appropriate. So,
Oh, okay. Well, I used to work with Nancy quite a bit out here in California. She's retired now and lives on the beach.
uh-huh.
Uh, but she told me she loved Layman as well, and she told me stories about Do Re Mi, which they had done earlier.
Oh, I had forgotten that.
Yeah. So she was very fond of him as well. But uh, he at that time was like the king of Broadway. He had conducted so many shows. 'Cause he was
He, t-
David Merrick's guy originally.
he told me something very touching. He During the Second World War, he wanted to do his bit as a for the country, but this was even before the Eisenhower years. It was during the war. To be gay was to be totally rejected. He
Mhm.
went to work in Washington for the Navy in some kind of executive capacity, and for all the time he was in Washington, D.C., he had no relationships whatsoever because he knew if he did and they found out that he was gay, they would have kicked him out of
Right.
his country. And
Hmm.
he was so patriotic that he sacrificed his love life to
Just a
just to do good.
very decent man. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And I know he served with one of the military bands as like the band leader.
Oh,
And because but uh, in the band, I think he met there was Carol Huxley was the arranger who ended up doing a lot of work with him and Phil Lang on Broadway.
ah,
Another uncredited arranger.
yeah. I mean, I know that Phil doled out some of his work, but I never knew who the people were. Uh, but
Right.
uh, but I remember in one of the sessions, somebody showed up that I had never seen before. Was Carol a man?
Yes, Carol Huxley. Man.
That's good. I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well, I have something to do with the music out there." So I said, okay.
So it's okay.
Uh,
It's so funny because a lot of those guys, especially Don Walker, had a whole bunch of people that worked for them. And I wonder how that affected uh, any of your recording sessions. Were any of them participating, or was it just
Not that I would have been aware of, Larry.
right?
I
Yeah.
was only, no, no, I don't think it ever was an issue. I know that what the couple of recordings I did with Skitch Henderson, I know that virtually everything was handed out, but even though he was credited on some with being,
Oh yeah, no, he farmed it out.
yeah,
But that was the way it was done.
right,
It was just everybody knew that everybody else was helping
right.
everybody out. I've said many times Chelsea Music was really Don Walker's idea to have a whole bunch of arrangers and not just a copying
Oh,
service.
under what? Yeah, yeah,
And his two biggest ghosts were Red Ginsler and Irwin Kostal.
yeah. And Gensler was Tunik's hero, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So matter of fact, many times Jonathan and I, because since Kostal was my mentor and Ginsler was his, it's like, mine was better than yours. So, and the funny thing was that Irv and Red apparently were wary of each other because they were competition.
I see. Okay.
But although they were all very good friends. you know. Uh, there was a symposium some years ago that Stephen Susskind uh, ran down in Washington, and uh, uh, one of Red Ginsler's daughters was on the group, and Don Walker's daughter, and it was quite interesting to hear all the conversations about all of that stuff in that period of time. But you were there too for so many of the cast recordings. I remember another one that I'm very fond of is the Rothschilds, which
It was
is a beautiful recording.
it was a very good cast. Um, it was the beginning of my really intense friendship with Sheldon, which lasted almost until he died. He,
Hmm.
his last few years were not easy, um, but he was a very decent violinist, and I was a good pianist. Used to be anyway. But I was. I played well, and so we would get together and play Mozart and Brahms violin and piano sonatas, and then I wrote. I orchestrated his version of, I guess it was "Smiling the Boy Fell Dead,"
Which I love the score. I know the score.
and so I did several things for him. There were, I forget which show, but in one of them the music was lost. I had to take the whole thing from dictation and all that, which I was happy to do, and I was pretty proficient at that point in the Sibelius program, so I was able to hand him
Hmm.
stuff that looked fairly decent. Um, he was just a wonderful, wonderful person. We wrote two one-act operas together. Um, when we auditioned one of them, we workshopped one of them at the O'Neill, which was a great pleasure for me. And so there was something that just clicked with us. We enjoyed being together. We enjoyed writing together. When my friend Robert White was having his like 65th concert, he asked Sheldon and me to write a song for him, which we did. So it was a very active
Hmm.
friendship, and and our wives became friendly. They were both at the Art Students League, um, and then there was a memorial for him last year at the Music Box Theater. And a lot of people were there. I remember I ran into David Shire there. I
Hmm.
ran into a lot of people who knew Sheldon, and Margie had a small party, private party after it that we were invited to, and it was. I saw his daughter again, who I hadn't seen in many years, and who said to me that her that I was very important to Sheldon in his life,
Hmm.
and so I started to cry. And then I
Oh,
thought
sure.
the cynical part of me was, well, I bet she said that to every guy who walked in the room, but I don't know. But it, and and then of all things, Margie was sitting with wife number two, Elaine May, at
Hmm.
this party. They had become friendly, and I said to Elaine May, whom I'd never met, I said I had the great pleasure of writing the score for such good friends, because she had written the book. She said, I hate
Right.
my work on that. I said, okay, okay. She didn't want to talk about it. She said, project for whatever reason. She anyway. I don't know what else to say about Sheldon. I know I'm not being very coherent, but he was like the big brother I never had because he had so much talent and so much experience,
Hmm.
and we just clicked. That's all.
He
Um,
was a very kind man, and he was very nice to me because of my history with Irv Kostal, who orchestrated Fiorello and Tenderloin. So he went out of his way to be very nice to me. And I also remember one time I was friendly with Patricia Wilson, who from Fiorello, and she was in New York, and I had dinner with Pat, Margie, and Sheldon,
Sheldon, yeah.
and it was just very nice. And he never said anything nasty about anybody. He was so careful
Yeah,
about
he
it.
was very careful. He was very careful.
And
He
I
was
ended
very
up,
careful
or
about Jerome Robbins, which
yes,
that was an uneasy. I mean, who had a nice relationship with Jerome Robbins, but
right,
he was careful. Yeah.
yeah,
So,
and I ended up orchestrating the cut songs from Fiddler for a recording that was done.
oh,
I don't,
okay.
I don't know if you've ever heard that recording.
Well, I
Eh,
heard, I know the most recent one they wrote was something called Topsy Turvy, which they wrote for the revival. I mean, Jerry and Sheldon actually got
Yeah,
together, right?
and
Once.
wrote it.
Yeah, I think there was something like 13 songs cut from Fiddler, but if it may very well be a recording I never heard. And
It was the Yiddish Fiddler, and they decided to record the cut songs as an addendum to the Yiddish
I mean, I
version.
remember when Messiah comes,
Yes, we
yeah,
did that.
yeah.
But there were some others that really from the trunk, but I was so happy to
Well,
orchestrate them because I know the style so well because it was Costel, even though he had not done Fiddler, I know how he would have done it. And it was a great pleasure for me. And of course,
yeah.
even though it was the Yiddish recording, it was in English. And Sheldon was at
Wait,
the
wait a minute, wait.
session.
It was a Yiddish recording, but it was in English?
The news the
Wait,
cut the,
but
the the cut songs were
the
in
cut
English,
songs were in English. Oh, okay.
but
Oh,
the rest of it was in Yiddish. And Sheldon was at the session. He was very complimentary.
yes.
And also, when they did Fiorello at Encores, he added something, and I orchestrated it
Oh,
uh, in the style of Costel.
I was
So
probably there. Yeah, yeah.
they made a reprise of the names LaGuardia that Fiorello sang himself in the
Ah,
second half, and they extended it, and it clearly, to me, the music was also by Sheldon.
could well be. He had a show called Dragons, which he loved, and he kept on working on it and working on it, and he could never get a first class production of it. I think to the end of his life, Dragons was his one frustration love. This was the show he never really was able to get on the way he wanted to. Uh,
Do you know about Miracles? That Do you know anything about that?
oh, I know a song called Wonder of Wonder, a Miracle
Of
of Miracle.
course. Well, he wrote another show called Miracles, which was they were trying to compete with Christmas Carol, and we're doing a Jewish version of the Miracles, and they had David Shire, Stephen Schwartz, uh, and Marvin Hamlish write the score, and Sheldon wrote the lyrics
I know
for.
nothing about this.
And it didn't get on, but we got into a studio. Don Pippin conducted it, and we did a recording of all these songs. The trouble was they didn't contact Dave Shire, Marvin Hamlish, Stephen Schwartz, or Sheldon. So they were, wanting to shut this down. But there is a recording floating around, and it's quite good. And I orchestrated, so I'm proud
Oh,
of it. But Pippin conducted it,
well,
and
he did a Christmas Carol in the end with Michel Legrand,
right.
and then he turned it in, and then an actor named Alan Safier turned it
Hmm.
into a one-man show, and so actually I wrote the orchestrations for that.
Oh
So
wow.
yeah, um, I'm not a clever orchestrator craftsman. I mean, I don't. There are the tricks of the trade are things I don't know, but I do have a sense of style and a sense of appropriate instrumentation, and so my
Hmm.
stuff isn't bad, but it's not remarkable. It's just it's fine, but I'm I never really I never really learned all the tricks of the trade. I never had the background that you guys had, growing up, with Costal or Burns, and seeing the way they did things and how, I don't know what the hell that is. Uh, I guess it's my phone.
Well, well, I think what it is those guys always were looking for some little hook to impress somebody. I mean that they really were, and they found little devices that they all used, uh, especially for Broadway to make it, sparkle a little bit. Especially as Lehman said, I think in his biography many years ago, uh, a Broadway pit band was 25, which today sounds like, you know, the Los Angeles Philharmonic,
Huge.
but 25 is really not a big orchestra.
Oh,
It's a combo with some strings.
that's right.
Uh, so now we look at it like it was massive.
That's right.
Costel said to me, and this is terrible, but he said orchestrating a Broadway show is child's play. For him, maybe. But it's very serious business. And I wanted to lead you into to another direction, which is
Oh, yes, please.
your recordings of the Sondheim shows are, of course, seminal and what everybody listens to and how everybody knows these shows to exist. And your Follies recording at Carnegie Hall. Was it Carnegie Hall? Yeah. No,
No.
Lincoln Center. Lincoln Center. Is, of course, a definitive recording. And I, I, I want to know how you feel about those recordings. Sweeney Todd, of course, was spectacular and has made it live on forever. The music was pretty good. And
Not bad. Not bad. Yeah. Had its moments.
uh, so I just want to know a little bit about the
Well,
Pacific Overtures also. Uh,
well, it's easiest in a way for me to talk about Sweeney Todd because that's the one that I most thoroughly uh, tried to turn into a radio play, as it were. Where well, I guess I've done that with several of Steve's shows, not all of them. I did it with Sunday in the Park with George as well. But I I believe that, as you well know, forget what I believe. When a show works, almost generally, when a show works, it's because the book works. Um, that doesn't take into account some of the perhaps jukebox shows, but the really, I mean, Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote great songs all throughout their career, but some of their shows worked and some didn't, and the ones that worked were the ones where the book worked. And
mhm.
I grew up in the evolution of recording, and as it went from 78s to 33s to CDs, where there was more and more opportunity to include material in addition to the songs. And it all began for me in junior high when there was an elective course called uh, radio plays, where a bunch of us kids would sit together at a table while the instructor, Mr. Morse, had both a phonograph and a sound effects sort of Foley stuff that he was doing. And there we were, a bunch of kids sitting around a table, with a lot of acne spread around the room, and reading plays of Norman Corwin while Mr. Morse would put in music from The Pines of Rome or from the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony or Spellbound. And when we finished, and he played it back on his Revere tape recorder, suddenly we weren't just a bunch of kids anymore. I could fantasize the actual structure of the play because of what was included, even though we weren't very good.
Mhm.
And a few years after that, and this is in the book, was when I listened to the Liebersons' virtually complete Porgy and Bess, made in around 1951, which Lehman conducted, which is a fantastic recording, um, and which includes a tremendous amount of sound effects, whether it's the dice rolling or the storm or whatever. Anyway, and that influenced me very much. I I feel, not exclusively, but I feel that to a very large degree, the shows that speak the most to me are the ones where I understand why the song is there, what it,
Hmm.
and I want that setup in my recordings. I want the continuity between songs. It doesn't have to be every word from the play, but I want enough of it that you don't have to read the liner notes, you don't have to see the sets, lights, and costumes, but you can listen to it and you have an experience that goes beyond merely admiring how wonderful the songs are. Now, you can't do it every time. A Jerry Herman show is really about the songs. And,
Right.
and that, but a Stephen Sondheim show is about characters, and it's about people who often don't quite mean what they say, or where there's or there's some dirt under all that, or people don't always speak the truth. Steve is always getting to that underbelly. There are reasons why they sing what they sing, whether they're speaking honestly or whether they're speaking deceitfully. But these songs relate to their character and the situations in the show. And I feel strongly that as a listener, whether you've seen the show or not, I want to give you what that show is about, not just
Hmm.
how skillful the lyrics and music is. It's very important to me, and sometimes I've gone overboard. Sometimes I wish I had done more, but I believe very strongly. And what made it great working with Steve, and this is in the book, of course, is that he felt the same way. He felt that making adjustments in the show to accommodate a recording, no sets, lights, or costumes, was something that he was very happy to do. He wanted it to work on its own and not necessarily as a reference to what you saw on stage. And that, in many ways, that identified our relationship. Now, it's not, you couldn't do it in every case. Pacific Overtures stood fine without any interstitial dialogue. So did actually Follies in Concert, although obviously we had some, but not a lot. Um, but it began for me with Company, where there was an irony in the song, The Little Things You Do Together, which was juxtaposed with the karate match with Barbara Barry and Charlie Kimbrough. And I felt that was important. I felt
Hmm.
I felt that it's one of the things that made the song even funnier and even more offbeat to hear these two people fighting, and hitting each other. And that was even though Lieberson produced that great Porgy and Bess, the fact is, by and large, Lieberson did not like dialogue, did not like sound effects. He just, he grew up when the hit parade grew up. The
Hmm.
songs ran 2.5 minutes on 10-inch 78s, right? So he was tuned into what's the best way to get the song across, and he was fantastic at that. I mentioned in the book that I saw um, a documentary of the making of Bells Are Ringing. I think
Hmm.
where he worked with Judy Holliday on The Party's Over, making it far more of an internal uh, thought process,
Hmm.
rather than something through which she was entertaining the audience.
Right.
And that to me was Goddard's greatest strength was not in trying to recreate the show, but it was in saying you don't sing or perform necessarily the same way in front of a microphone as you do when part of your obligation, whether mic'd or not, is whether you reach the second balcony. And his recordings, they're true to the spirit of the character who sings them. And generally, he at least in most of his recordings, he liked reverberation. He liked a lot of top end. So his recordings generally are kind of glitzy. And
Yeah.
when I did Bajur, which was my first on Broadway original cast recording,
Hmm.
I just wanted to do, what would Goddard have done here? You know,
Hmm.
that's all that informed me on that. You know,
Yeah.
how would Goddard have done this? And so, to the best of my ability, that's what I tried to do.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, your recordings have succeeded so well in what you've wanted because I mean, all the Sondheim shows are brilliantly recorded, and I know that Lieberson didn't like dialogue because I've read that many, and he would get rid of it because the idea was who wants to hear the dialogue on repeated listenings. However, these days, I think theater aficionados really prefer knowing what's going on because they do, even though you were changing them slightly, they do use them as reference for how the show sounded. And I think that's really important.
there are two recordings of um, just a minute. I've got two things going on in my head about, but talking about Kiss of the Spider Woman, there was a
Hmm.
recording that was made. I think it was actually made in London when the show first opened, and then a year or two later, I was asked to do the one with Vanessa Williams. And there's a
Right.
world of difference in those two recordings, and I don't think the first one is very good, despite the fact that Chita Rivera is quite wonderful on her own. But
Hmm.
a show like Spider Woman needs the the dreams, the passions, the frailty,
Right.
cruelty. You just can't do, if you want to do justice to the show, you're not doing a show that has hit tunes in it. You're doing a show that has music and lyrics that are wedded to these awful situations. And you must present them.
You have to have context.
You
Yeah, context.
context.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I did a revival of Annie, which I did entirely as like a children's book with music, but it never came out in that version because Charnin was not happy with the way Lapine had directed the show. Lapine
Hmm.
given all these kids New York accents. He wanted a New York type of show, and
Yeah.
that bothered Charnin very much, who probably directed almost all previous versions of Annie. So the recording that finally hit the market is a plain old songs, and the songs are really kind
Yeah.
of beautiful. But there's a whole other album out there which tells the entire story. By the way, did you ever notice Sweeney Todd? Is that just disgusting? Da da ba 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 ba. Tomorrow. I love.
Oh, right. So you're
Yes.
saying Steve ghosted tomorrow? No.
Well, tomorrow got there first. But well, somebody said to me, "Well, he was just doing a parody." I said, "Bullshit." He just we
It was
all
just,
we have unconscious moments. He talked about how he impressed Cole Porter with the line in Gypsy, uh, "Ego amigo," whoever
yeah.
no fits, no fights, no feuds, and no egos, amigos together. He said, well,
Right.
that actually comes from a children's song, Ferdinand, Ferdinand, the bull with the delicate ego,
Yeah.
Ferdinand, Ferdinand, the keeper so called him amigo.
So
So it always made me very happy to think that it was a children's song that got there first. But
you just reminded me of something. When when I was conducting Sweeney Todd at the Kennedy Center, and Steve was very much involved, he comes to me in the chorus room and says, "I want you to change something." I said, "What do you want me to change?" He says, "You know where the chorus is singing, 'What a perfect machine he was,' is the lyric." He said, "I want you to ask the chorus to sing, 'What a fucking machine he was.'" And I laughed, and he said, "I'm not joking." And I said, "Tell me why." And he said, "If you're doing it at the right tempo, which you are," he said, "so it sounds like a machine." He says, "the whole audience will turn and go, 'What did they say?'"
that's what
So
he
I,
wanted. Yeah.
I I brought the chorus in and retrained them to sing "What a fucking machine he was," and all the chorus girls were, which some of them came out of church choirs, were going "Oh," like that, and uh, one of the girls said, "Excuse me, Maestro, is it fucking or fucking?"
Oh, I love it. Well, if it was
And
Steve, he probably put the G on it, right?
he
Yes.
did,
Okay.
and but we kept it in the show, and I have a recording of it. I mean, a pirate recording of it that way. And I've
Sweeney was
told,
great fun. Sweeney was great fun to
yeah,
record. Because all that opportunity, with the factory whistle and as mentioned in the book, I call it the horizontal laundry chute because the body I couldn't drop the body,
yeah.
so I had to,
So
which by the way, the guy who did all the heavy lifting and the dropping and all that was my associate J. David Sachs, and
mhm.
he died about 4 weeks ago.
Yes, I saw that.
That's
Yeah,
that's it's a great loss. He was a terrific human being and a great
yeah,
producer, and he did so much of the heavy lifting on that Sweeney Todd recording, because it took quite a while, adding whether it was footsteps or bells or the sound of the chair, and I mean there was all kinds of stuff to turn this recording into an acoustic melodrama, and a lot of the ideas, yes, they came from me, but a lot of the fulfillment of it, the really hard labor, was Jay taking his own body and crashing it to the floor,
yeah,
sliding across the room. And
yeah. That's great. I mean, of course, I met him once, so I know
wonderful person, wonderful
it's.
person.
Uh, but all of that stuff is what makes those recordings and what makes them so. Uh, there's something else I want to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Listen, growing up listening to all of what was Columbia Records and then RCA because of you going to RCA and all that, um, uh, there there are so many little flubs on recordings. For instance, here's an obvious one. In uh, Lieberson's recording of Bye Bye Birdie, Dick Van Dyke has a terrible crack in his voice and put on a happy face. And people say, "Why did he leave that?" And I said, "Because it was probably the best take." And probably also it was 2 o'clock in the morning and it was the last thing he recorded. And that was it. So,
Well, I've got a few of those myself. I have a I have a wrong entrance of Mandy at some point in the Secret Garden. Uh, it's very tiny; you can hardly hear it, but I didn't catch it at the time. Well, when Goddard did not do his own editing and mixing, at least not in the time I knew him, and everything, as you probably know, this was in the days of vinyl. Basically, that was my era. The liner notes and the credits and everything were printed before the recording sessions took place because they were waiting, assembled at the factory, for the discs to be manufactured and inserted. As a result, there was a tremendous time pressure. So at the end of a morning session, whatever tapes Goddard had done were sent uptown from, because the studio was 30th Street at 3rd Avenue, was sent uptown, and somebody else, usually Tio Macero, was editing them. Now, there was a limit to how deep you could edit because you were under the gun. You knew that 24 hours from that point, those tapes were going to be in Terre Haute or wherever, because these vinyl discs were about to be manufactured. So they weren't perfect. And of course, as we went back years later I remixed a lot of these things for Columbia, for Sony. Later, I could go back and listen to the takes before the pieces were chosen, and in some cases, improve upon them.
I wanted to mention something when you were talking about the time crunch. I remember I was going to the High School of Performing Arts, and a new show would be recorded, let's say Apple Tree or something like that. And I was recorded on Sunday, and on Thursday it was at Sam Goody's on 49th Street.
Wow.
And we used to wait for it to be delivered. And I remembered, how could it be Sunday and Thursday it's in the stores, edited, mixed, ready to go?
That really does sound. I wonder if that was a case where they recorded it before it opened. We did that with La Cage aux Folles, actually.
That I know, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know how it would have happened that quickly. You're talking about early 1960s with
Yeah,
about 61 or 62. Uh,
it
beats
was pretty fast,
very,
pretty
very,
fast.
yeah.
And it's funny you say about, I remember La Cage being recorded because of my relationship with the show. I wasn't around for the recording, but I remember Don Pippin telling me about it. And the only unfortunate thing about a few of the recordings that were recorded early is the band was not yet used to playing the show.
Uh,
And I've always been aware of that because, Broadway band, once they get into it, they're fantastic.
yeah.
And La Cage sounds great. But
But I'm see, I wasn't aware of that. So you're saying it would have been better a few weeks later.
yeah, because the band gets into their groove
Uh,
and they're so familiar with it. Costel told me a story you probably heard about West Side Story. Lenny always complained that as the show went on that it got too fast, so he pulled it back for his recording, the tempos. And the story goes that Costel told me Lenny had heard the tempos were too fast, so he invited Sid and Irv to go to a performance with him. And Max Goberman was the conductor, and they were in the back of the theater listening, and all the tempi were too fast. And Lenny wanted to run down the aisle and, kill Max. And Irv said that he and Sid said, wait to the end of the show. Wait to the end of the show. At the end of the show, Lenny runs down to the pit and he says, where's Max? And one of the violinists said, oh, Max moved up to New Rochelle and the last train is at 10:55. So he was indeed speeding up the show. And
that's
Irv
very
said,
funny.
Irv said they could never slow it down again because the players had it under their fingers and they just couldn't do it.
Couldn't do it. Interesting. That's a wonderful story.
They're- So also I know on all of the cast recordings, especially I'm sure you did this as well, but with Lieberson, didn't he double the string size
Oh,
for
easily. We uh, there were probably uh, at least 10 first violins. Yes.
right.
The orchestras would be between 35 and 40 pieces for
But
the recording sessions.
so more strings and also probably a trumpet player to help out or something
Yeah,
like that.
sometimes a trumpet, sometimes a French horn. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, there were a few. Um, yeah, I would say 35 was probably the average size
Hmm.
of of the orchestras we used. Um,
So young orchestrators are always shocked when they see the scores and it was only five violins in the score, or and a viola and a cello.
I think in Sunday in the Park with George, I think we had three different sized orchestras depending on which session and which material was being
Hmm.
recorded. And I can't possibly define that for you right
Yeah.
now, but I do know that conceptually we were dealing with different sizes. That there was
Hey,
some,
something interesting. When I started doing film orchestration, which was a whole different thing, and Irv was around to guide me. One time I was doing a film with Mark Shaman, and he'll hate me for saying this, but it was a picture called Forget Paris, a lot of big band stuff, and it was wonderful to do. But we had, if I remember correctly, 28 violins, eight, 10 violas, and 10 celli. It was a huge orchestra. And I said, Mark, I said, this is way too many strings for a big band score. It's just overpowering. And he said, shh. And I said, why? He said, my next picture, I'm going to need the string section. And they'll say, your arranger said you only needed 12 violins.
right. The
So,
things that
so
informed final products that have nothing to do with these are wonderful stories.
yeah. Tell me, of the recordings you did, this is uh, a tricky question. I know you love Sweeney Todd, but is there any particular recording that you're particularly proud of or not so proud of?
The one I'm most proud of, even beyond Sweeney Todd, is the complete Porgy and Bess with the Houston Grand Opera. That's the best. It's the best recording I've ever done.
Is that John DeMaine conducting?
And he was great, by the way.
Yeah,
His
yeah.
understanding of the score was terrific. The cast was terrific. I made that recording so that the listener is not 10th row center. The listener is right smack on inside Catfish Row. That's the way that recording sounds. That these
Wow.
characters, you're there. There's Porgy and there's his house to your left, his cave, and there's Sport and Life, and there's the goat cart, and you are surrounded as best you can be by Catfish Row. That was my goal in making this recording, to put you in there. And I don't listen to it often because it's three CDs. It takes a long time. But I played it for myself, Act One, Act Two, and Act Three, only 3 or 4 weeks ago. First of
Hmm.
all, I think it's one of the greatest pieces ever written. I
It's fantastic. Yeah.
I think, and I know Wozzeck and I know various other 20th century operas. I think if I had to pick the greatest opera of the 20th century, I would say Porgy and Bess. It's a masterpiece, and it's an
Hmm.
incredible masterpiece considering the lyricist for the first act was not really the lyricist for the second and third act. I mean, Dubose Hayward wrote all the lyrics for Act One, and Ira Gershwin didn't come in until Act Two. Um, but somehow or other, this amalgamation of talent and Gershwin's assimilation of various styles and dramatic tricks in a way is so fantastic. Um, I just loved everything about making that recording. There was a very decent house pianist from the theater, but I brought in Dick Hyman. I think all this stuff is in the book,
Yeah.
and finding a piano that wasn't too good, that wasn't too bad for Jasper Brown to play, because I didn't want it to sound like a caricature. I didn't want it to sound like a shitty old piano, and I didn't want it to sound like a Steinway either. I wanted something
Right.
ordinary, just plain old, blatantly ordinary. Turns out there was a piano in one of the producer's offices 2 doors down that was just fantastically ordinary. And so we used it. And then I was able to take the entire beginning of Porgy and Bess with because while Jasper Brown is playing, the chorus is going wah do wah oh wah do wah, and I set it up because there is an accretion in the number of singers as it goes along. I set it up so that the thing traveled, that the doo-wahs started here and then got added to and added to and added to and added until finally the final doo-wahs, the stage is exploding with virtually everybody who lives on Catfish Row.
Mhm.
Well, everything I had, Larry, I put into that recording. Um, every move that I wanted each actor to make from mic to mic, I wrote in their piano vocal scores. Obviously, they didn't need the scores, but they had them on the stands, so I didn't have to tell them and stop them. When you get to this line, you're going to move to the next microphone.
Mhm.
So I never plotted anything so carefully, so deliberately, and it's the best example I know of where my adoration for the material itself just compelled me to do everything in my power to send that back to you. I wanted I wanted you to hear, I want you to hear.
Yeah.
And it's a
But
fascinating. Also, I don't know if many people are aware of this, but the white people in the show never sing. They only speak.
huh.
It's an interesting thing that Gershwin did, which I don't think many people pay too much attention to. But the only music comes out of the black people. The white, it's an interesting.
Wow.
You
It
also
is interesting.
you also know probably that it ain't necessarily so. It's Baruch Shem, Baruch Hatoshem of you know,
Hmm. Yeah. It's Jewish folk tunes.
Jewish folk.
But what's interesting to me about, creating this oral and audio picture, uh, because of all the recordings I heard growing up, it's very important to me when I've worked on recordings that the picture of the orchestra is is what you hear. In other words, with the strings on the left and the brass on the right. And I know you've been very fussy about the placement of the orchestra and what you're hearing. So it feels like you're enveloped with an orchestra. And it's become part of my credo too. There was I don't want to offend the producer, but on one particular show I did, I got a mix back, and I said, "How come you mixed it in mono?"
So
And I
you
made them
feel like
remix it because everything was coming from in front of me. And I said, I'm so used to sitting in the pit with the trumpets are on my extreme right and the strings on the extreme left. And I had to explain to this particular producer that, the F holes on the violins are facing out to the audience. That's why the strings are on the left. Rather, and I said, when they do the thing where the seconds are on the right, it's because they expect the seconds to be softer than
well, I
and
think in certain classical music, well, of course, we can mic it any way we want, but I think it makes sense that the seconds are separated from the first because some of these composers really wrote somewhat antiphonally.
that's right, but not for show music as a
No,
rule.
no.
Pop music.
But certain things, it's in the book as well. But for example, the really double basses, for example, which on stage would be on the right usually, but I put
Hmm.
them in the middle because I wanted the lower frequency sounds to be coming out of both speakers.
Right. I understood.
I mean, and I wanted enough percussion players so that a player didn't have to run around all the time. And the percussion I spread all the way across the back so
The
that
back.
percussion was always in stereo. If the triangle was far away
Right.
from the timpani, good. Um,
Exactly. It's something Phil Lang told me, which you'll appreciate. He, in a standard pit situation, the bass was usually on the right hand side,
yes,
and the harp was usually behind the strings all the way to the left in the old theater pits.
yeah.
And he said he would very often put the bass line on the harp, doubling the bass, so that the actors could hear the bottom of the
That's
orchestra.
very interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean not boom, 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 but he would do it just so they had octaves and stuff.
Well, we had
To
the harps on the left, but of course the harp was separately mic'd. So
Yes, of
the
course.
harp,
Yeah.
had a certain immediacy. Uh, it
But
was,
but that's great though that you had the percussion in the back, which is what it is. And later as my career progressed, I did much more concert conducting, and that's the way an orchestra setup is.
right,
So it felt more like that. But
right.
but it's funny in show albums to hear, how different producers mix.
Yeah,
You and Lieberson were always very consistent,
I think
and
so. I mean, with the horns were generally on the left. Trombones, I usually separated, not be, I didn't want them to sound behind the trumpets. I generally had them more centered. So I had some spread with the brass, where from right to left it was high brass, um, mid tenor brass, and then
the
horns.
low brass, yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I don't know. It just felt clearer to me to do things that way.
But he says all your choices are so conscious. It's not like you just said, okay, let's go.
No, I'm very stereo conscious.
Yeah.
I grew up when we went. Look, I started with 78. In 1948, along came the LP, and then the stereo came just about 2 years before I started at Columbia. Stereo came in 1958. The stereo disc, that is.
Yes.
So I sort of in my life moved from. As a matter of fact, the first recordings I ever owned. I mean, the first phonograph I ever owned was an acoustic phonograph. It was a wind up.
Mhm. Yeah.
So and one of the and by the way, I don't know how important this is, but when we talk about dialogue, yes or no on recordings, what you can do on CD, and I often did, was you can separately band the CD if the listener wants to skip the dialogue
We
between
could do it.
words. He'll hit the fast forward, whatever it's called, and just go on to the next track. I believe I did "Kiss of the Spider Woman" that way.
Mhm.
That you can get past the stuff if you want to.
There's two things I have to share with you, which I think you'll appreciate that Costal told me. One was when all the CDs came out, when they were all remastered by you, and also Capitol reissued all of their shows and CD. I gave them to Costal because he had top of the line equipment and he could play this stuff. And he listened to the recordings of the shows he had done and all that. And I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Well, what I think is the recording equipment we had in the 40s and 50s was fantastic. It was just the playback equipment that wasn't." He said the needle in the groove was bad, but he said the recording equipment was
Yeah,
superb. Listen to this.
yeah,
It's great.
yeah.
And then the other thing he said to me about stereo, he said when he orchestrated Fiorello, there was a song in it called Marie's Law, where the two characters are here and here, stage right and left. And he tried to orchestrate it so if the actor was on stage left, he would put the orchestra into the woodwinds who were or the strings who were in the left of the
Oh,
pit.
how interesting.
And the singer who was here, he put the accompaniment in the brass. And he said, then they'd cross and he'd cross the instrumentation. And he said it was fantastic until George Abbott restaged the song.
Oh, okay.
But he said in the theater, he said he was so happy with himself, hearing the opposite sides.
It's
And
very
he did it just for his own amusement. You know. So it's the other thing Steve Sondheim said to me, we were talking about the Sweeney recording, and this is when I was conducting the show at the Amundsen here. And he said, you realize that the last show where I had a big orchestra was Sweeney Todd. And he said every show he did after that, the orchestra was 14. Passion and Into the Woods and this one and that one, which I,
yeah. Well, I didn't do well. Into the Jay did Into the Woods. He did a beautiful job on it. Jay also did Assassins. Um, Passion. That let me see. That was Phil Ramone. that was on another label. I'm surprised that the orchestra was that small. Sweeney, yes, it was very large on Sweeney. We it was practically, as a matter of fact, I believe on the Sweeney recording or in the booklet, we actually list the orchestra and the names of each of the
Yeah.
players. Um,
Yeah.
but Sweeney, that's when he had his heart attack, right? Yeah,
I
19.
believe so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, 79. It was March or April. Yes, but Sweeney is a terrific show, and working. Some people are beautiful to work with, like Angela Lansbury. They're just wonderful people who are fun to be around, and
Hmm.
who you develop a rapport with. You develop a warmth to it.
Yes.
Then there are
So
people.
like I
Yeah,
go ahead. You were saying there are people like,
that's this thing. Then there are people you want to murder.
yeah,
Like Robert Nemiroff, who,
yeah.
oh, what a pain in the ass he was.
It's funny you were saying about Angela. I did a TV movie, Mrs. Santa Claus, Jerry Herman score, and I was the orchestrator, and Don Pippin was the conductor. And I said to her, one day, I said, Angie, you sound like a cello, and she said, not a viola.
Cute.
And the other thing was, we recorded at O'Henry's in Burbank, and you had to walk through the vocal booth to get into the orchestra room because it was the way the studio was designed. And uh, I had done one arrangement that I was particularly proud of, and I was walking in to talk to Don, and I said, "You sound fantastic." And she said, "With an arrangement like that, how can I help?"
That's so
Just
sweet. That's so sweet.
a sweetheart. But the best part of this session, you'll love it because you know the people involved. Don was in the room conducting, and all of a sudden something bothered him. And we're all sitting in the booth. The engineer was John Richards, who you might know, and very British, does a lot of movies. And Angela and her husband Peter were sitting in the booth, and Jerry Herman, and blah, 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 everybody was there. And Don was in the room rehearsing the orchestra, and something upset him. And he comes barreling into the room, into the booth, and starts yelling at everybody. I mean, uncharacteristic for Don Pippin, just like a madman. And I think he was trying to make his presence known or something. And everybody in the room was stunned into silence. And Angela was sitting there like she'd known Don for millions of years. She's like this. And Don goes out of the room, and nope, everybody was speechless. And I turned around and looked at her and said, "Who was that?" And it broke the thing. And she broke up in the whole room. But it was so shocking for Don to
Yeah,
do
I
that.
can't imagine it. I just can't imagine it.
Now you said about your favorite being Porgy. Is there anything that I don't want to say that you're not proud of, but that you want to talk about that?
Well, I'm trying to think. Of course, it always bothers me when I think there's something I could have fixed or didn't fix. By and large, um, I think there were sessions that I didn't like working with Ben Bagley, I didn't like, and I certainly didn't
Mhm.
like Nemiroff being around, and I had problems with David Merrick. But I don't think any of that stopped me from trying to pursue getting the results I wanted, and I don't think, as I think of it now, that there's any album that I regret. I don't think so. Uh,
Well, the thing, and I want to not forget to mention this. Of course, you mentioned the company recording earlier, and of course, it was all videoed, and uh, everyone who loves music theater and what we're talking about has seen that video, which I think is very revealing about the whole process. And of course, it's a video, so it's edited and all that stuff. But and I knew Stritch pretty well, so watching all of that. happen, and then she comes in and gives a fantastic performance. Uh, you know, was revealing to a lot of people. How do you feel about that video and the
Well,
company recording?
I regret the way I behaved very much. First of all, calling her performance flaccid was really the wrong choice of words. What was on my mind was she was drunk.
Yes.
But I couldn't say that. Um, but I deeply regret the way I spoke to her because the job of a producer is to be constructive and to get the best out of somebody. And you never get the best out of somebody by just tearing them down. What doesn't come through as a fact of life in watching the documentary is that the documentary runs about 50 minutes long, and the recording session ran 18 hours long.
Hmm.
So what you're seeing at that point was exhaustion and frustration on my part, and inebriety, what inebria on her. So you were getting
Yes.
the worst of both of us, and it shows. But you can't tell in 50 minutes why is she tipsy and why is he so mean. Uh,
Right.
and that so yes, you asked what do I regret? No, I don't regret the final product, but I regret that for eternity, because I've now seen this film a few times, even with an audience, that I behaved badly. I should have
Mhm.
had. I shouldn't have let my guard down. I shouldn't have. Anyway, it's a regret. There's nothing I can do about it now.
Mm.
Um, I was at one screening of it. My daughter was there. She was about 12 or 13 at the time, and I was hissed by by the audience. It was a largely gay audience, and when I criticized Elaine, it was throughout the
Oh,
house. So so yes, True Confessions. That was a bad moment captured for eternity.
well, I'll just tell you, you shouldn't feel so badly. I understand because, you know, Stretch was a piece of work, and she was fantastic, and you know how charming she could be as well. But she was clearly piss drunk and making that, uh, and it was obvious. And I admired at least the little quick captions with Hal Hastings trying to smooth over because he was a supreme diplomat,
Yes.
uh, which is part of being a conductor's bedside
Yeah.
manner,
He was.
especially
Yeah.
especially in a theater situation. But I always wondered, did you do one track with the song in a lower key and then,
Yes.
but that wasn't the one that was used, right?
No, the lower key was used for her to try and sing over, and it
Right,
didn't work. And that's
right.
when it was decided, let's just record the orchestra in the home key. The one thing I can't remember, Larry, and I don't know how we did it, is that when we brought her in a few days later to do it, she wasn't wearing headphones when she sang it. And I still haven't figured out how we gave her the music without its leaking. I don't know what the hell we did, but it seems quite clear by looking at it that she wasn't wearing cans.
Huh. It's isn't that funny? And you didn't have in-ears in those days, so
No, no.
huh?
So I guess we were feeding it to her quietly at her feet,
Yeah, maybe
and
it was some. You know,
because
it's so funny now. Conducting in the theater, they always have hotspot speakers for the conductor.
mhm,
And I said, I remember when I first started conducting on Broadway, which would have been 1975, there were two mics in the pit. There was one here and one there, and that was it. There was not multiple miking, except for promises, promises, and stuff like that. So, and Jack Mann or Jack Shearing were usually the sound guys, and they did a fantastic job. And now you can't conduct a show without a hotspot feeding the conductor. You can't hear the singers ever, ever. And I've done so many concerts where the singers are insisting on, fold back and all this stuff. And I said, you have you have an 80-piece orchestra behind you. What do you need speakers for?
Yeah, yeah.
It's become
No,
it's
you're right.
become something else.
Yeah, Barbara Cook wanted it for the Follies, the
Yeah.
concert. Uh, Finally, she realized she didn't need it. Like you say, there was a 70-piece orchestra behind her.
Yeah. And the other thing is, when I first started as a conductor, and this would be your experience as well, if I were in the pit conducting and I couldn't hear the singer, I would hush the orchestra.
Hmm.
Simple as that. And I also knew that the people behind me could hear the singer because they were singing over my head. So it depended, and the first class orchestrators like Tunick and Phil Lang and all those guys knew how to balance an orchestra,
Yeah, you bet.
orchestration wise. And it always amused me. Phil Lang told me that he was on the road with some show with George Abbott directing. And he said that when we play the Schubert in New Haven, we have to put the mutes in the brass because the pit was too high. He said when we went to the Schubert in Boston, the pit was so deep we took the mutes out. And George Abbott put up his hand and basically said to Phil, if you know all of this, why are you bothering me with this shit?
I think I learned more about you than you learned about me, and it was a pleasure to learn it. I really
Oh,
this was wonderful.
well,
So,
maybe I talk too much about myself,
oh
but
no, not at all.
but it was delightful to. We can talk anytime, of course, anytime
Okay,
you like. See you
peace.
soon.
You
Yeah,
bet.
bye.